I'm going to decided today to throw out a number of new concepts, or potentially new concepts to you, but which are really important. And I've been working on this since the pandemic, I guess. So let's get straight into it, because that means that as I've got a little bit more time, if this is going to move. Try again. Have the batteries gone? Oh, here we go. So, but before I do, I just wanted to, I don't often do this, a quick shout out for Dr. Niarchos here, who's a pretty fantastic guy actually, and very good athletics record as well, and a senior research fellow at the British Heart Foundation, and more importantly from a personal perspective, the guy who has made sure that I'm able to speak to you today, who's fitted with me with some bionics, and done an outstanding job. So thank you, Dr. Niarchos, and another great reason why we need to make sure that the NHS services are well preserved. So if we're looking at sustainability, we've got a few questions we've got to sort of start asking ourselves. And what I've been doing, some people might think I was a little bit rude earlier looking at my phone, but one of the reasons for looking at my phone was to put in the names of quite a few companies who are represented here today, and then put the word sustainability and see what people are doing about it. There was only one company that I saw which I could easily find something on sustainability on, who are involved in cybersecurity. There may well be more who just have done loads of stuff, but haven't put it on their website or haven't made it easily accessible. But it is really quite important that we do focus on this. So questions which come up are things like, what is the environmental cost of all this data creation that we're making all the time, the data transfer, the data storage? Something like 60% of all data created on the planet is only ever used once, and we're storing all this crap. Why? And there is a cost, because all these data centers take an awful lot of energy to keep them running. But how do we quantify the environmental cost of what we're doing in the cybersecurity world? What data, what statistics should we be collecting? And once we've collected all those data and statistics, how do we analyze them? How do we try and make sure that the information we're taking from them really does impact our decision-making process without giving us lots of confirmation bias and skewing the results and giving lots of opportunities for other smart lawyers like Sandeep Patel, KC, this morning to come in and punish you severely for greenwashing and various other new forms of offences which are coming through the legal system. So an easy way of looking at it might be to say, well, let's have a look at the total energy that we're using over a particular time period, and then divide that by the amount of data that we're storing or collecting or transferring or whatever. And then once we've got that figure, we can have a look at the energy per amount of data and then multiply that by a certain carbon factor. And of course the carbon factor is going to vary depending on where you're getting your energy from. So if you're getting it from renewables or from gas, or it's coming in via oil or whatever, there will be a different carbon factor associated with that. And then, these first sort of bunch of questions are really looking at data and the data sector in particular. But are there any particular issues revolving around cybersecurity? Because a bit like a greyhound is a dog is not necessarily a greyhound. Cybersecurity is obviously data, but data is not necessarily cybersecurity. So what do you do once you've got your figures back? Well, to make sure that those figures are going to mean something and can be actioned, they will need to be translated. Now, an awful lot of you will have found this translation issue in your companies, particularly when you're talking to non-tech people on a board, that you're going to have to explain certain things to them and make sure that they get it, and that can be quite a challenge. as, again, Sandeep mentioned this morning when he was trying to explain certain concepts around cybersecurity to the judge. We need to recognise assumptions that we've made in terms of estimation. So you'll come up with more of a range of results, I would suggest, rather than anything else. And then you need to calculate the carbon use to make sure that you bring the sustainability issue into your data systems. And there are some people who've started providing these calculators which you can access through the web. So there's a couple there which I've given the URLs for on screen. And then you could look up something called the Ireland Index. Ireland is a bunch of islands between Sweden and Finland, which doesn't sound particularly relevant, but in relation to data, certainly, you can plug in there what you are up to, whatever activity you're up to, and it will give you an idea about carbon usage. When we're coming to looking at carbon usage and cybersecurity, we might need some extra research to be done. There's a lot of research being carried out in certain universities, and University College London and the NUS, that's not the National Union of Students, but the National University of Singapore, are both well up there. So you can follow quite a bit of that research, which is available on the web. And then following that, you need to have a look at a decarbonisation plan. And this is pretty important because a lot of us sort of sit there and we're playing with our phones, with our laptops, with various other sort of bits of IT kit, and it seems that, okay, you know, you have to plug it into the wall and charge it up, but what exactly is the carbon usage on that? And a lot of people think that data is pretty much free, and it's great, isn't it, because you don't have to rely on the Royal Mail, who are out on strike all the time, it seems to be, and will that get through the postal system? So data seems to be a much more effective and efficient way of getting messages across to people. But the research which has been carried out to date suggests that data centres are responsible for 2.5% of all human-induced carbon dioxide emissions. And to give you another way of looking at that figure, that's a greater carbon footprint than the aviation sector. So we're all worried about, you know, people leaping on planes and destroying the planet. Well, actually, all this data kleptomania which is going on, chucking stuff, you know, particularly imagery and video. And of course, as the data creation switches more from word into video, and hence, you know, rise of YouTube and TikTok and so on, that's just going to create much, much more data. And the data being produced is, 1.3 billion gigabytes of dark data every day. And that's equivalent, or has been put down as equivalent, to over 3 million flights from London to New York every day. This is quite startling, I think. And it's going to only be expected to get worse. So the world is expected to generate something like 97 zettabytes. I'd never heard of zettabytes until I started doing some research for this. But it's 97 trillion gigabytes of data this year. So that's quite, on a venture that's quite significant. So what do we do about it? One thing is to look at the different sort of scopes of the carbon emissions that we're doing. And the general idea which has been brought to research is to have a look at it in terms of different scopes. And like the pictures of the different kinds of scopes that we've got on the screen here, there are different scopes in terms of emissions. So we're looking at scope 1, which is direct emissions, scope 2, indirect emissions, and then scope 3 is when we're looking at the value chain of emissions of the data involved in the cybersecurity exercises that we're doing. So direct emissions are direct emissions from whatever your company owns or controls in way of sources. So it'll include on-site energy use, like, you know, is the on-site energy, does that come from natural gas or fuel? What about the fridges that you've got and the refrigerants, the emissions from combustion in boilers, and then whatever vehicles the company might be using. So there's an awful lot there in terms of direct emissions to look at. Second one is looking at indirect emissions from purchased energy. So this is having a look at where your energy is coming in from. So is that coming from steam? Is it heating? Is it cooling? Is it generated off-site? What kind of fuel source is it coming from, and what are those greenhouse gas emissions associated with that particular indirect emission. And then looking at scope 3, you're looking at more at the indirect value chain and the upstream and downstream elements of that as well. So the upstream side, we're looking at encompassing indirect greenhouse gas, that's what GHG is, greenhouse gas emissions within the company's value chain. And then the downstream, we're looking at basically goods which are sold or services which are provided after they've left your company's ownership and control. So there's quite a bit of an exercise to go through that. Has anybody here been involved in that? That's interesting. As I said, I could only find evidence of one company involved in cybersecurity who's represented at this event who has looked at sustainability at all. Let's have another look at something else which keeps coming up, and this has been mentioned in virtually every talk: crypto. But crypto and Bitcoin, in particular, Bitcoin is basically more than 50% of the cryptocurrency market, as it's loosely called. Involves this concept of mining. So you've got to go and find out by answering a mathematical question whether you can get hold of some Bitcoin and mint it yourself, as it were. When you're looking at energy use from Bitcoin, the world's total energy use on that is equivalent to the energy usage of a country like Argentina or Belgium. So Bitcoin is producing an awful lot of emissions. We might have seen recently or relatively recently, that the Chinese decided to ban Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. 80%, over 80% of Bitcoin mining at that stage was being undertaken in China. So, of course, China, the world's largest producer of carbon emissions, that's quite good news for them, because they get rid of a country's worth of emissions out of their calculations by banning Bitcoin. So it wasn't just about the natural tendency, as it seems to be, of the Chinese Communist Party for control over their population. And then, unfortunately, what happens is that Bitcoin doesn't just die as a result, but it just moves. And it's moved to other countries, primarily countries where it's a little bit cooler. So, because you need banks and banks and banks of computers to carry out these calculations. It's not something you can do on your iPhone anymore. And that's moved to places like Russia and Canada, which is good from the Chinese perspective, because that's given the emissions problem over to those countries, but it hasn't solved it. Other crypto energy demand from validating transactions via using the blockchain, computers and servers, and looking at the locations and energy types and usage as well. So again, another issue to look at in terms of what crypto you've actually got in front of you and whether that has a really disastrous planetary impact. Some crypto is much, much better than others, and the situation is changing quite dramatically. So Ethereum has very recently changed the way that it approaches its system, and that is much, much more energy efficient in terms of cryptocurrency in any way, and that's far, far better. So the message is to keep watching it. And if you're somebody who wants to save the planet, do some of this research before you start investing or dealing in this kind of product. So, and then you get other questions coming out of this sort of general issue, like, well, if we're not using cash, not using crypto, is cash environmentally better? A lot of cash has been sort of taken out of the market. There's much more in the way of digital payments. The digital payments sector is growing astronomically worldwide, so a great opportunity there, but is it actually environmentally friendly to do it that way? Should we be keeping cash, or just in case there is a massive sort of cyber attack? How are you going to even go out to the shop and buy some basics and stuff? But obviously cash has its own environmental issues in terms of printing, transportation, the polymers used in the notes that Bank of England has switched to. And then we're looking at transportation and use of ATMs and so on. So here's a diagram of carbon footprints and influence in the value chain. So on the vertical axis there, you've got the level of direct impact, and then on the horizontal one, you've got the level of direct influence. So you'll see there that people who've got a large footprint with high influence are people like equipment manufacturers and payment processors. And we're looking at things like terminals and cards. So a lot of these cards which we're carrying around in our pockets do have an environmental impact as well, perhaps surprisingly. Some people have done little bits of work looking at certain aspects of this. So Den Norske Bank in 2017 looked at their credit card transaction carbon footprint and then came up with the following figures there. So you can see that the data centres involved, although I mentioned that they hold an awful lot of dark data earlier, in terms of the credit card transaction footprint for this particular bank, the data centres only really made up about 10% of the emissions. The card manufacturer was more than that at 15%. But by far the greatest amount of the footprint related to the point of sale terminals at 75%, and that's split between the materials used in those credit card machines that we see at all various hotels and bars and so on, and the energy used in terms of charging those up and making sure they're going to work. I want to break slightly and introduce another concept to you. Now this basically arose out of the pandemic, and one of the things which was happening in the pandemic was, for me personally, was that lots of clients were wondering what the hell to do, and things were slowing down quite a bit. So that gives you a bit of time to look at other things. One of the things that I was being deluged with at the time was all this sort of stuff about COP26 and climate change. I thought, well, okay, what is there in that? Because there was an awful lot of hype, an awful lot of generality, and not much in the way of detail. So as a lawyer, you'd sit there and you'd say, so what? What's the worst case scenarios which can come out of this? If we do hit this golden target of 1.5 degrees centigrade and we don't warm the planet any more than that, are we in the clear? Are we okay? And sadly, the answer is no, because there are a whole raft of other issues where we are killing off the planet on which we live. Colonel John and quite a few other speakers this morning have mentioned the war in Ukraine, but there's a far bigger war that we have all been involved in since about 1970, and that's the war that we have decided to commit upon the planet on which we live, which is a pretty stupid and insane sort of thing to do, really. So what are the elements of that? Biodiversity. We've heard and seen and read a lot about that. Some of the figures are astounding. So to lose something like 95% of your insect population between 1970 and current is pretty dramatic. I think if we'd have lost 95% of the human population in that time period, we really would have focused on what the hell is going on. But we haven't done that on the insect world. If we look at other aspects of the animal kingdom, the figures there are usually ranged between about 65 and 75% loss. When the other startling figures there are things like when you look at the biomass of bird life on the planet, 75% of that is human controlled. It's chickens. It's just extraordinary. And when you look at the fauna side of it, similar issues come out of it. So biodiversity is another massive issue, and we need to include that in our sustainability calculations. Deforestation, we've heard an awful lot about that. It's not just the Amazon, and it's not just rainforest. It's forests going all the way across Russia, for example, and Canada and so on. And it's not just forests, but it's grasslands, it's mangroves, it's peat bogs, it's parts of the world which soak up an awful lot of carbon and which we are destroying, and at the same time as we destroy that, release all that into the atmosphere, and the climate gets worse. Desertification, so the Sahara Desert is moving southwards every year, and so are loads of other deserts. Massive desertification issues in central United States, for example. Massive similar issues across the whole of the Middle East. Soil degradation, that's another one which was a surprise to me. But the calculations are that even with the food, the delicious food that we've had for lunch today, we are only getting about 10 to 25%, depending on what food you had, of the nutrients that you would have got if we'd have had that meal 100 years ago. And that's because of the changes in agriculture. And of course, we just eat the food and nobody thinks about where the food's come from and how it's sort of put together and so on. Ocean degradation, a similar depressing picture. Pollution, you've probably all heard about plastic pollution. And there's another thing, because plastic breaks down into microplastics and gets into a food chain. It's been found in our human blood. And the general sort of calculations are that we are eating, each one of us, around about a credit card worth of plastic every week, just out of microplastics in our food. So there is no escape from this. Pollution is not just about plastics, it's all about air pollution, it's about light pollution, that doesn't really get much of a headline, and other forms of pollution as well. My next issue was resource abuse. So on the one side of that, that's illegal mining, which happens in many, many countries when the illegal mining means masses of pollution, also means masses of deforestation. But we need those resources, don't we? Because we use them in our phones, in our data centres, all this sort of talk about lithium and copper and so on, which we don't have much of in this country, and we have to get from other places. It's not just about mining on the resources side, it's also about waste. So if we look at, again, if I take food from lunch, food is just extraordinary. 40% of our food which is produced just goes to waste. And we, because of political issues like Brexit, can't get the workers over in the UK, and the farmers been ploughing the food back into the ground because we can't even harvest what we've grown. Water, no life without water. Another area which is the real problem. And then one of the big elephants in the room, population. So a lot of people say, well, yeah, okay, we're just about to hit 8 billion people. That's due to happen someday next month. And then the population is due to go up over 10 billion. And people are still focusing on just those raw numbers. It's not just about the raw numbers. It's about how much each of those people are consuming. So the average American, for example, will consume 7 times of the amount of planetary resources as the average Indian person. What does that mean? Well, there's 1.4 billion Indian people on the planet, or people in India on the planet. There's only 350 million or so Americans. But if you looked at it from a consumption angle, you'd have to ratchet up the American population by a factor of 7, and that would mean that you'd got effectively 2.4 billion people in the United States. So we need to get beyond the basic figures is the message there. What have I done on that in terms? I do a lot of financial crime work. I do a lot of anti-money laundering, chasing sort of bad people doing bad things around the world, some of which, well, all of which has a cyber relation to it, because that's where all the transactions are taking place. So what I've done on this slide here, this is, in my humble opinion, probably about the best slide that I've ever, or the most important slide I've ever produced. It's messy, it's incomplete, But it's a good start on probably the biggest issue that we are facing on the whole of the planet. So what I've done here is to take those 10 issues that I've mentioned there and then put the financial crime, or venture to put the financial crime implications on the right-hand side. And there is I've done a blog on this. It's on my firm's website that you can access and read a little bit more detail on that. But you can see the picture there. There's every single area there's a criminal element involved. And we need to get a grip on that. And why is this important with cybersecurity? Well, because we're looking at security of the data that we're collecting, and that data contains all the details of who's doing this stuff. So cybersecurity is really important from another aspect as well. So who's doing anything about this? I tried to see whether anybody's got anything on sustainability in government. I'm really glad from this perspective that Liz Truss has just resigned, because some of the aspects of her policy, she sees in my mind is a climate change denier. She's very much in favour of fossil fuels, which is just a disaster for the planet. We need desperately to switch over to renewable energy. And of course, we need to make sure that people who've got a headline role in climate go to COP27 and are not sort of confined to Buckingham Palace. So anyway, we look at other aspects of UK government. I am quite impressed, I have to say, with the NCSC, the National Cyber Security Centre. I've seen a number of new government departments and entities produced over the years in which I've been working, and this is one of the best ones. And I wasn't really particularly surprised when I saw that they have done something in terms of sustainability. So the mission, which I think Colonel John mentioned earlier, is to make the UK the safest place to live and work online. That is a great mission, I think. It's not bifurcated. You know exactly what it is. It's a simple mission. It's something you can remember. If you're ever putting a mission together, and John and I've got a military background as well, we've done an awful lot of producing missions for people. You just make it simple and you make sure it covers the 5 W's of what you want to achieve. You should never, ever put how to do it in a mission statement. That's up to whoever you charge with carrying out the mission to do. And if you put a how to do it in there, you end up with real problems. And that is one of the reasons why the Russians are failing so badly, is because they put the how in there. We don't do that in the British military. We leave that up to frontline commanders. They make the decisions, and that's why we've got one of the best militaries in the world alongside the Israelis. But there's no point just having a mission if you haven't got a vision. And I was quite interested to see that the first word in the NCSC vision is sustainability. And their vision is to make sure that sustainability is reflected across all of NCSC work, and that the NCSC contributes to a sustainable future in the NCSC areas of expertise. And I thought that's really commendable. But has anybody picked up on this? Did anybody know this before today? No. So great at putting it together, but NCSC needs to get this message out there a bit more. So what has NCSC done on sustainability? You can find it on their website. This is where it's come from. They have 5 different focuses there, and on the right-hand side, they give examples of what they mean by the focus, which is great because it's already starting to translate the message through into practicality. So, you're looking at understanding the environmental implications of future technologies, like crypto, like sort of discussed or mentioned earlier with a contrast between Bitcoin and Ethereum. So when you're looking at the example of that, how do you consider the energy consumption of those future technologies? What is the energy consumption of strong cryptography, for example? And where is that energy coming from? So there's a number of different areas of focus and examples there that you can follow through. And I really would urge you that this is one of the most important things that each and every one of us can do. I mean, forget the war in the Ukraine and focusing on that sort of stuff. We need to save the planet. If there's no planet, we're not here. It doesn't matter how many jobs there are in cybersecurity. If there's no water or something because somebody's hacked the water supply controls, then we're in severe difficulty. Look elsewhere, and World Economic Forum has done a little bit of work on this, but again, it's pretty high level and not much amount of detail. So 3 things come up on the World Economic Forum on this. First of all, recognition that cyber attacks present a huge risk to the value of companies and undermine, ultimately, the stability of society, and particularly when you're looking at CNI, critical national infrastructure, by which I mean, energy, and the last reports about how important energy are, as you've seen with 30% of Ukraine power stations being destroyed by Russian military activity. The next one that World Economic Forum comes up with is saying that companies need to start managing their cyber security as part of their ESG strategy. I wonder if anybody's done that yet. Good ideas coming out of some of these forums, or fora, I should say, and things that we need to take away and do. If we don't take the action, we're going to just disappear. The biggest killer of all UK companies is something called FTI, failure to implement. So please do something when you leave today. I'll be really happy if you do so. I'll be even happier if you do want to get in touch and tell me what you've done. That'd be brilliant. So the second one there, start managing cybersecurity as part of the strategy rather than relying on insurance. Because I don't know if many of you have had experience of the insurance world with, say, a cyber attack, or with an accident to your car, or trying to get back from another country and relying on an insurance claim. It is really difficult. And in terms of cyber, even more difficult. Because if you look at a mature insurance market like the motor industry, there's something like 100 years worth of data there. So they work out, how much the insurance is going to cost, and how insurance companies can support you after you've had a crash. There is not that kind of data available in relation to cybersecurity. So an awful lot of the cybersecurity policies are probably not worth the paper they're written on or the screen that they've been typed up on. Third element there with the World Economic Forum is a standard framework for measuring cyber risk would help organisations and regulators to manage it. Well, yes, thank you, Sherlock Holmes. If you haven't got the data, you're going to make very poor decisions. So, what about this is my last last element really. What about the environmental impacts on the cyber sector? Well, I hinted at data kleptomania before. There's a big thing around, isn't there? We'll just collect this data and keep it because you never know, we might need it. Really, if you look at all the data that you've collected, how much of that are you using afterwards? And as it changes over to video and imagery, of course, the data storage requirements go up, and so does the environmental impact. Have a look at the environmental costs of manufacturing hardware, for example, compared to the lifespan. So the average lifespan of the phones that we've got in our pockets, each and every one of us, on average, we change those over once every 2 years. What do we do with the old one? We just put it in a drawer at home. There are thought to be something like 2 billion mobile phones sitting in drawers in the UK. Each of those have got really rare metals, rare earths in. Those really do need to be recycled so that we don't cause damage to the planet. Worldwide, the we, and I can't remember, apologies, I can't remember what that stands for, but you look it up on the web and it will come back. Their figures are that something like 5.3 billion mobile phones will be thrown away in 2022. Well, that's quite a lot, isn't it? 5.3 billion mobile phones. There's only 8 billion people on the planet. We're not being very savvy about use of our electronic waste, really. Data center energy I've mentioned already. Systems emissions, yeah. Payments to the sanctioned. Yeah, what I mean by that is that all the data which you're looking at in terms of protection for cybersecurity will have all the evidence of the criminal trails involved there. So yes, we do need to preserve data, particularly when it comes to payment transactions. And that is because in my world, when you're trying to take action against people who are money laundering, you have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt each and every transaction in the value chain. And if there's a breakage in that value chain, in that transaction chain, then the launderer has won and law enforcement has lost. We need systems supporting, or I need to see whether any of your systems support terroricide directly or indirectly, knowingly, recklessly, or negligently. And this is another issue. One of the company that I mentioned earlier that I'd spotted and has done something, not just in cybersecurity, but has addressed their sustainability bit as well, has said things like, we're going to make sure that we are using electric vehicles. Well, yeah, electric vehicles are, in my view, a stepping stone on the way to proper sustainability. They're not really going to be the answer that the planet needs. A good first step. Now, the trouble with electric vehicles is that they have batteries, and the batteries don't last for very long. And the other thing is that those batteries contain a number of rare earths and rare metals. And you trace that back and you might end up, say, where does that actually come from? And it may well come from, say, the DRC, where an awful lot of this stuff is mined. And then you look at that a bit more closely, and then you start discovering that Chinese organised crime gangs are lifting children out of Zimbabwe and dumping them to work in the mines in the DRC. So actually, by buying an electric vehicle, are you supporting modern slavery and child trafficking? So we need to get much more savvy about this kind of thing. And water usage as well is a really important element because data centers use an awful lot of water and they produce an awful lot of heat. But we can get creative about that. So there's a report last week about certain data centers and with the heat that they generate, well, just use that heat to heat nearby towns and villages and so on. Put it to good use rather than just trying to work out how to get rid of it and just dump it into the atmosphere and warm up the planet even more. So related issues for the cyber sector, at the current level of sustainability, or should I say non-sustainability, we will need 3 planets to support human activity. We've only got one, in case you hadn't noticed, despite Elon Musk trying desperately hard to find another one that we can move at least him to. So we do need to be much more savvy about this and take it on board really quickly. Carbon and climate, as I mentioned with my terracide slide, are just one of the impacts because we can stay at 1.5 degrees and we could still be stuffed, to borrow the title of somebody else's speech. So we do need to have a look at those 9 other key issues that I mentioned, and maybe not just do a sustainability analysis and the 3 scopes that I mentioned earlier, as has been developed, and quite a few large companies are doing something about that, so it's not entirely without hope. But nobody's really looking at the other elements involved. So perhaps we need to switch to more of a planetary impact analysis. And we need to be really savvy about coming up with certain solutions. Because you think, well, okay, renewable energy, and people say wind. Oh, that's good, isn't it? Wind turbines, we'll stick those up. Well, where are we going to put them? Well, an awful lot of people don't want them in their back doors. And actually, when you look at the science, it's much better to site those wind turbines offshore because there's no mountains in the way. The wind blows an awful lot better, and it's much more effective and efficient. But if you've sited those offshore wind turbines in a bird migration route, then you've given yourself a biodiversity issue. Then there's a question of the turbines themselves. So we can recycle virtually most of the materials in those wind turbines, but we haven't worked out how to recycle the blades. So at the moment, the only thing that we can do with turbine blades is chop them up and bury them. So when it's like this on every single issue. We think, there's a nice, easy solution. No, it isn't. There's always something behind it. So we do need to look at that in a bit more detail. Now, is there a good side of putting some effort into this in terms of your own business? Well, yes, because 70% of consumers feel it's really important for brands to be eco-friendly and sustainable, to have good carbon footprint or a low carbon footprint per transaction. Some of the Swedish credit card companies have been saying, well, maybe we ought to give, instead of having a transaction size limit on your credit card, we'll have a carbon limit. And we will do an assessment there automatically, with an AI thing or whatever. We'll do an assessment of how much carbon you are using, and then when you hit that carbon limit, you can't use your card anymore. That would get messaged back around to people pretty quickly, I think. 93% of the largest 250 companies are now reporting on sustainability. That doesn't seem to have got into the cybersecurity sector at the moment, but hey, nobody really knew about this, and hopefully people will start doing stuff. And the dark data is a big issue, clearly. I think this is pretty much my last slide now. So, yes, data kleptomania, I've mentioned. Data compression, that's obviously quite useful. Work out how we can store the data and exactly, can we be more savvy about it? Do we really need to store everything? Impact of AI on this, can we get those systems to focus on that? Who actually puts sustainability requirements into the development of AI? I haven't heard anybody mention that yet, but maybe that's something which is on the way to come. Have a look at energy, both the type and the usage at all stages in your cybersecurity model. So it's not just, how do you get to your place of work to do your cybersecurity, but, what's the carbon involved in the cybersecurity work that you're doing. Water usage, particularly high in data centers and so on. But then we've got a few other bits and pieces that we can follow through. So address the value and the supply chain, and do start working on a planetary impact analysis. So this is my final slide. I do love action. I do love, that's not just that great song, which was pumped out in Birmingham quite a few years ago when I was around here. But carrying out action is important. If we don't do that, we are on the way to disappearing off the planet. Auto-extinction, I think it should be called. So do carry out your sustainability assessment, and then start moving through into other aspects of your impact on the planet, whether it's pollution, whether it's biodiversity or whatever. Do in that plan focus on what I call OKRs. These are really, really important. Not many people have heard about them. People will have heard of KPIs. 1 minute. People have heard of KPIs, but these are objectives and key results. This is the methodology behind the growth of big companies like Twitter in a very short space of time. Very, very important. Think laterally, and do please share your experience so we all learn and we all have a better chance of meeting here next year. And if you want to follow up with me on any of those issues, then do feel free. I'm not like a normal lawyer, so I'm not going to be hitting the time button as soon as I receive your email and giving you a huge bill. But I really would like to hear back from you what's going on, and any questions, queries, things I might be able to help you with. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.